October 19, 1781. A 21-year-old enslaved man stood among British officers at Yorktown as General Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington, ending the Revolutionary War. The British had no idea the man serving them was the spy who destroyed them. His intelligence won American independence. Then he went back to being a slave for 6 more years. This is exactly how it happened. Virginia. The Revolutionary War is collapsing. The Continental Army is desperate for intelligence on British troop movements. But there's one massive problem. British camps are surrounded by armed guards who shoot suspected spies on sight. The Americans need someone the British would never suspect. They find him working in a tobacco field. By early 1781, the British were dominating the South. General Cornwallis has 7,200 troops moving through Virginia, burning plantations, seizing supplies, and crushing any resistance. The Continental Army needs eyes inside the British operation. But traditional spies, white men with fake identities, are being caught and hanged. The British have gotten too good at detecting them. Marquis de Lafayette, commanding American forces in Virginia, realizes something. The British camps are full of enslaved people, servants, cooks, laborers, brought in from captured plantations. They're everywhere, but they're invisible. The British don't see them as threats. They see them as property. Lafayette has an idea. What if that invisibility became a weapon? James Armistead is 21 years old in the spring of 1781. He's enslaved on the plantation of William Armistead in New Kent County, Virginia. He can read, unusual for an enslaved person in 1781. He can write, and he's been watching the war tear through Virginia for months. Here's what makes his next decision extraordinary. When Lafayette's recruiters arrive looking for someone willing to infiltrate British camps, James volunteers. Not for money, he's enslaved. He can't legally own property. Not for freedom. There's no guarantee he'll ever be freed, even if he succeeds. He volunteers knowing that if he's caught, he'll be executed. No trial, no mercy, just a rope. Think about what he's actually agreeing to do. He's going to walk into an enemy military camp, surrounded by thousands of armed soldiers, pretend to be a runaway slave seeking British protection, gain their trust, extract their military secrets, and somehow get that intelligence back to the Americans, all while maintaining his cover. One wrong word, one suspicious glance, and he's dead. And the country he's risking his life for, it's going to send him back to being enslaved when this is over. William Armistead, James's owner, gives permission, not because he believes in the cause, but because Lafayette requests it personally. In 1781, in Virginia, that kind of personal request from a French general carries weight. James receives basic training from Continental Army officers. How to observe without appearing to observe. How to memorize troop counts, artillery positions, and supply schedules. How to pass information through dead drops and trusted intermediaries. But here's the brilliant part of Lafayette's plan. James won't just spy. He'll become a double agent. He'll convince the British he's spying for them. The strategy is ruthless. James will approach the British lines, claiming he's escaped from Lafayette's camp. He'll offer to spy on the Americans. The British will trust him because they assume enslaved people hate the Continental Army. And honestly, many do. The Americans aren't exactly offering freedom. So James will feed the British information. Some of it is true, but harmless. Most of it is false. Carefully crafted lies designed to misdirect British strategy. Meanwhile, he'll gather real intelligence on British plans and pass it back to Lafayette. It's psychological warfare at its finest, and it requires James to be smarter than everyone around him every single day for months. Spring 1781. James approaches British picket lines near Yorktown. He tells the story Lafayette prepared. He escaped from a rebel camp. He knows the area, and he wants to help the king's forces. The British take him in. Within weeks, he's working directly in General Cornwallis's headquarters, not as a spy, as a servant, invisible, trusted, positioned exactly where he needs to be. The British believe they've recruited him. They have no idea who really owns his loyalty. And for the next 6 months, James Armistead will become the most valuable intelligence asset in the entire Revolutionary War. But gaining access to Cornwallis's headquarters is just the beginning. Now comes the hard part, staying alive while playing both sides. Because British officers are watching him. Continental officers are watching him. And one mistake will get him hanged by one side or the other. The question is, how did an enslaved 21-year-old pull off the most sophisticated double-agent operation in American history? General Cornwallis trusts him. Lafayette trusts him. And both of them believe James Armistead is working exclusively for them. For 6 months, he'll walk this tightrope. One mistake, one inconsistency in his story, and he's exposed. The question is, how do you lie to everyone while telling the truth to the people who matter? Summer 1781. James has been inside Cornwallis's headquarters for weeks. He's doing exactly what enslaved servants do in British camps. Cleaning, cooking, running errands, carrying messages between officers. But here's what the British don't see. Every conversation he overhears gets memorized. Every map he glimpses gets recorded in his mind. Every supply wagon he counts gets cataloged. And he's giving the British exactly what they want. Information about Continental Army positions. Except it's wrong. Lafayette has trained him on what to reveal. Troop movements that are 2 days old. Supply counts that are inflated. Defensive positions the Americans have already abandoned. It's all technically true. True enough that if the British check, they won't find obvious lies. But it's useless intelligence. Stale. Misdirecting. The brilliance is in the timing. James tells the British things they can verify. But by the time they verify them, the situation has changed. They trust him because he's accurate. They don't realize he's always one step behind reality. But while James is feeding the British yesterday's news, he's watching today's actual plans unfold. He sees dispatches being prepared. He overhears officers discussing reinforcement schedules. He watches supply shipments being organized and counts how many cannons are being moved where. This is the intelligence Lafayette needs. Not where Cornwallis was yesterday, where he's going tomorrow. James memorizes everything. He can't write it down. Getting caught with written intelligence means instant execution. So he develops a system. He associates troop counts with visual anchors, artillery positions with landmarks, officer names with physical descriptions. His mind becomes a walking intelligence archive. Here's what makes this nearly impossible. James isn't just managing one story. He's managing multiple timelines across 2 enemy camps. When he's with the British, he has to remember exactly what false information he's already given them. Because if his new lies contradict his old lies, he's exposed. When he passes intelligence to Lafayette, he has to remember what the British think the Americans know. So Lafayette can avoid accidentally revealing that his source is compromised. It's psychological chess at a level most trained spies never achieve. And James is doing it while pretending to be illiterate, subservient, and invisible. One memory slip ends everything. James can't just walk out of British lines to report to Lafayette. That would be instantly suspicious. So they use a network. There are other enslaved people working in British camps. Some are genuine refugees seeking British protection. Others, like James, are Continental Intelligence assets. They don't all know each other. That's the protection. If one is caught, they can't betray the others. James passes information through trusted intermediaries. A conversation that sounds casual. A hidden note left in a specific location. Encoded messages in routine supply requests. One of his contacts is a woman working in British officer kitchens. Another is a man repairing wagons. They look like servants. They're actually an intelligence network. The information flows from James to intermediaries, to Continental scouts, to Lafayette's headquarters. By the time it reaches Lafayette, it's been passed through 3 or 4 people, making it nearly impossible for the British to trace back to James even if they intercept it. But here's the danger. This system depends on trust. One betrayal, one person breaking under interrogation, and the entire network collapses. July 1781. Cornwallis is planning a major movement. He's received intelligence from his own spies that the Continental Army is weak in a specific sector. He's preparing to attack. What Cornwallis doesn't know, that intelligence came from James. It was false. Lafayette has reinforced that exact sector with hidden artillery. James gets the British attack plan, time, direction, troop strength, to Lafayette 48 hours before the assault. When the British attack, they walk into a trap. Continental forces decimate the advance units. Cornwallis loses hundreds of men and critical momentum. The British blame their own intelligence for the disaster. They never suspect their trusted servant. James stands in Cornwallis's headquarters the next day, listening to officers rage about bad information, watching them doubt their own spies. He successfully framed other British intelligence sources for his own work. James has proven he can feed the British false intelligence and extract real secrets. But that's just a tactical advantage. What Lafayette needs is strategic intelligence, the kind that wins wars. Because Cornwallis is planning something massive, a defensive position that could prolong the war for years. And James is about to discover exactly where Cornwallis intends to make his stand. The intelligence he's about to gather will end the Revolutionary War. But first, he has to survive long enough to deliver it. August 1781. James discovers something that changes everything. Cornwallis isn't planning another attack. He's planning a defense, a fortified position, so strong it could extend the war for years. But if Washington knows exactly where Cornwallis is going to dig in, he can trap him there. James has 72 hours to get this intelligence to Lafayette before the British position becomes unbreakable. August 12, 1781. James is in Cornwallis's headquarters when he sees it. A map spread across the general's desk. Not a battle map, a fortification map. Yorktown, Virginia, a small tobacco port on the York River. The map shows detailed defensive positions, where the artillery will be placed, where trenches will be dug, where British ships will anchor to provide naval support. Cornwallis is building a fortress. The British strategy has shifted. They can't defeat Washington in open battle. The Continental Army has gotten too strong. But if Cornwallis can create an unbreakable defensive position, he can force a stalemate, hold Yorktown indefinitely, keep the South under British control, make the war so expensive and exhausting that the Americans eventually negotiate for something less than full independence. It's a brilliant strategy. If Washington doesn't know it's happening, James memorizes everything on that map. The exact positions of planned gun emplacements, the weakest points in the defensive line, the location where British ships will anchor, the supply routes on which Cornwallis is depending on. He knows this intelligence is different. This isn't about winning a battle. This is about ending the war. But there's a problem. Cornwallis is moving his entire army to Yorktown within days. Once the British are entrenched and fortified, attacking them becomes a bloodbath, maybe impossible. James needs to get this intelligence to Lafayette before the British finish their defensive positions. And he can't just walk out of camp. Cornwallis is moving his headquarters to Yorktown, and James is expected to move with them. If he disappears now, right after seeing those fortification plans, the British will know they've been compromised. So James does something incredibly risky. He volunteers to go on a supply run, a legitimate reason to leave camp. It's the kind of task enslaved servants do all the time. Fetch supplies from a nearby farm. Bring them back. The British approve it without suspicion. James takes a supply wagon, and instead of going to the farm, he goes straight to a Continental Army outpost. He's risking everything on this one run. If anyone checks on him, if the supply timeline doesn't match, if the British get suspicious, he's exposed. He gets the intelligence from Lafayette's network. All of it, Yorktown's exact location, the fortification plans, the defensive weaknesses, the naval support positions. Then he goes to the farm, gets the supplies, and returns to the British camp as if nothing happened. Here's what makes this moment extraordinary. James doesn't know if his intelligence will actually be used. He knows Lafayette will get the information, but will Washington believe it? Will they commit to a massive siege based on intelligence from an enslaved spy? Will the French Navy, crucial for blocking British ships, actually show up where they're needed? James has done his part. Now he has to go to Yorktown with Cornwallis's army and wait to see if the Continental Army acts on his intelligence. If they do, he'll be trapped inside the siege on the British side. If they don't, the war continues. And everything he's risked will have been for nothing. September 28, 1781. James is inside British fortifications at Yorktown when he sees Continental Army banners appear on the horizon. Washington believed him. More than that, Washington is committing everything. 17,600 American and French troops surround Yorktown. French naval ships block the York River, exactly where James said British supply ships would need to anchor. Cornwallis is trapped. The fortress he thought would be his strength has become his prison, and James is inside it. For 3 weeks, James watches the siege unfold from the British perspective. He sees Cornwallis realize he's surrounded with no escape. He watches British officers argue about whether to attempt a breakout, an idea they abandon because they don't have enough ships to evacuate. He hears the American artillery bombardment, watches British defenses crack, sees supplies run low. The entire time, James maintains his cover. He serves in Cornwallis's headquarters while American cannons pound the fortifications. He listens to British officers despair while pretending to be unaware of what any of it means. October 19th, 1781. This is where we started. Cornwallis sends word he's ready to surrender. British drummers beat the signal for parley. White flags rise over Yorktown's battered walls. James stands among British officers as they prepare to surrender to Washington. He's been inside British operations for 6 months. He's fed them false intelligence, stolen their real plans, and passed information that led directly to this moment. The British still don't know. He watches Cornwallis's sword being offered in surrender. He sees British troops stack their weapons. He hears the silence as the Revolutionary War effectively ends. He helped win American independence. And in a few hours, he'll go back to being enslaved. The war is over. Washington has won. The United States of America will exist. But James Armistead's fight isn't finished, because the country he helped create doesn't recognize him as a citizen. The freedom he secured for others doesn't apply to him. And now he has to figure out how to win his own freedom in a nation that owes him everything, but legally owes him nothing. The hardest battle is just beginning. October 20th, 1781, the day after Cornwallis surrenders. George Washington is celebrated as the father of a new nation. Lafayette receives honors from Congress. And James Armistead? He's sent back to William Armistead's plantation, back to field work, back to being property. For 6 years, the spy who won the war will petition for freedom he helped secure for everyone else. November 1781. The Continental Army is celebrating. British prisoners are being processed. Peace negotiations are beginning. America is about to become independent. James Armistead goes back to being enslaved. Here's what makes this particularly bitter. He's not just forgotten, he's actively hidden. The Continental Army can't acknowledge his service publicly because that would compromise any other enslaved intelligence assets still operating. Loose lips get spies killed, so there's no ceremony, no official recognition, no documentation of what he did. Lafayette knows. Washington knows through Lafayette's reports. A handful of Continental officers know. But Virginia law doesn't care what they know. James is the legal property of William Armistead, and unless William chooses to free him, which would cost William money and property, James remains enslaved regardless of his service. William Armistead isn't a villain in this story. He's just a Virginia plantation owner who gave permission for his slave to help the Continental Army. Now the war is over, and he expects his property back. It's not personal. It's just economics. That's what makes it worse. 3 years after Yorktown, James learns about other Virginia enslaved people who served in the Revolutionary War, receiving freedom as compensation. Not many, but some. Virginia has a process. If you serve the Continental Army with distinction, you can petition the state legislature for manumission, legal freedom. You need proof of service. You need testimonials from officers. You need the legislature to vote in your favor. James begins the process. But here's the problem. His service was covert. There are no official military records of his assignment, no documented orders, no public acknowledgement that he was even a spy, because acknowledging him would reveal Continental intelligence methods. So James writes a petition by hand. He details what he did: infiltrating British camps, gathering intelligence, feeding false information to Cornwallis, and providing the intelligence that led to Yorktown. And he knows it sounds unbelievable. An enslaved man claiming he was Washington's key intelligence asset, without paperwork, without witnesses willing to speak publicly? The Virginia legislature rejects his petition, not because they don't believe him, because they can't verify it. Think about what the legislature is asking for. They want documentation of secret intelligence work. They want public testimony about covert operations. They want proof of something that was specifically designed to leave no proof. It's a perfect bureaucratic catch. 22. James did exactly what made him valuable as a spy. He stayed invisible. Now that invisibility is being used to deny him freedom. And here's the cruel irony. If James had been a regular soldier, fired a musket in battle, had his name on a muster roll, he might already be free. But because he did something far more valuable and far more dangerous, he can't prove it. Lafayette hears about James's rejected petition, and Lafayette is furious. Lafayette writes a personal testimonial, not just a letter, a sworn affidavit. He describes James's service in detail. He confirms the intelligence James provided. He states explicitly that James's work was essential to the surrender at Yorktown. This is extraordinary. Lafayette is an internationally famous general. He's a French nobleman. He's celebrated across 2 continents. And he's putting his reputation on record to vouch for an enslaved spy. Lafayette sends the affidavit to James with instructions. Submit this with a new petition. But there's still a problem. William Armistead has to agree. Under Virginia law, even if the legislature grants freedom, the owner can refuse and keep the person enslaved. The legislature would have to compensate William for his loss of property. William isn't immediately convinced. He's losing a skilled worker. That's real economic value. Lafayette writes to William directly. He explains James's service. He makes the moral case. He offers to personally compensate William if needed. November 1786, 5 years after Yorktown, James submits his second petition to the Virginia legislature. This time he has Lafayette's sworn testimonial. He has William Armistead's reluctant permission. He has documentation from Continental Army officers who worked with Lafayette's intelligence network. The petition goes before the Virginia General Assembly on November 30th, 1786. It passes. The act says James, at the peril of his life, found means to frequent the British camp, and that his intelligence contributed largely to the surrender of Cornwallis. January 9th, 1787. More than 5 years after he helped end the Revolutionary War, James Armistead legally becomes a free man. He's 27 years old. He spent 6 years of his adult life waiting for a country to acknowledge what it owed him. And here's what makes this moment complex. James wins his freedom through official channels. He petitions. He waits. He plays by the rules of a system that was designed to keep him enslaved. He doesn't rebel. He doesn't escape. He trusts that eventually justice will work. And it does. But only because a French general used his privilege to force the system to acknowledge an inconvenient truth. James is free. But freedom in 1787 Virginia doesn't mean equality. It doesn't mean prosperity. And it doesn't mean recognition. So what does James Armistead do with his freedom? How does he live in a country that he helped create, but that doesn't fully accept him as a citizen? And what happens to his story after he dies? Why does one of the most important spies in American history nearly disappear from history entirely? James Armistead Lafayette is free. He takes his former general's name as his own, a choice that says everything about loyalty and honor. He'll live another 43 years as a free man. He'll buy land, raise a family, and receive a military pension. But his story will nearly vanish from history until someone decides it's too important to forget. James Armistead becomes James Armistead Lafayette, adding his general's surname in honor. It's not required. It's not expected. It's his choice. He settles in Virginia. He buys 40 acres of land, something impossible when he was enslaved. He marries. He has children. He becomes a farmer, working land that actually belongs to him. In 1818, 37 years after Yorktown, the Virginia legislature finally grants him a military pension, $40 a year. It's not much, but it's recognition, official acknowledgement that yes, he served. Yes, his contribution mattered. Lafayette returns to America in 1824 on a farewell tour. He's 67 years old, making one last visit to the country he helped create. He comes to Virginia specifically to see James. Think about what that means. One of the most famous men in the world makes time to visit a black farmer in rural Virginia. They meet. They reminisce. There's a portrait painted of them together. One of the only visual records of James that exists. In that portrait, James is wearing his finest clothes, standing with dignity, equal in the frame with a French general and American hero. It's a quiet rebellion. In 1824 Virginia, that kind of equality, even just in an image, is radical. James Armistead Lafayette dies in 1830. He's about 70 years old. He's buried in Virginia. And then American history forgets him. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually. History books focus on the famous names, Washington, Lafayette, Hamilton. When they mention Yorktown, they talk about French naval support, about siege tactics, about Cornwallis's mistakes. They don't mention the enslaved spy who made it all possible. Why? Part of it is racism. American history in the 1800s and early 1900s is written primarily by white historians who don't think black contributions are worth recording, or who assume enslaved people couldn't have done anything sophisticated enough to matter. Part of it is the nature of intelligence work. Spies don't get monuments. Their work stays classified, stays secret, becomes invisible even when the secrecy is no longer necessary. And part of it is uncomfortable truth. James's story asks difficult questions. How does a nation celebrate a founding father who owned slaves? How do we honor a revolution for liberty that excluded most of its people from that liberty? How do we tell the story of American independence when some people most responsible for winning it weren't considered fully human by the country they helped create? Easier to just not tell that story. But here's what makes historical erasure so dangerous. When we don't know these stories, we think the problems they reveal are new. We think institutional racism is a modern invention. We think intelligence agencies just discovered the value of diversity. We think questions about who deserves freedom and citizenship are 21st century debates. They're not. They're founding questions. James Armistead Lafayette was asking them in 1787. And when we erase the people who navigated these contradictions with dignity and intelligence, we lose the roadmap they created. We lose the evidence that it's possible to demand justice from a system designed to deny it and win. The 20th century brings a gradual rediscovery. Black historians, particularly during the Civil Rights Movement, started recovering these stories. They dig through archives. They find the petitions. They find Lafayette's testimonial. They find James. In 1982, 200 years after his intelligence work changed history, the U.S. government finally issues a postage stamp in his honor. It shows him and Lafayette together, based on that 1824 portrait. In 2020, the CIA formally recognized him in their intelligence history programs. They call him one of the most successful intelligence operatives in American history. Streets get named after him. Schools. Historical markers appear at Yorktown, acknowledging his contribution. It takes 2 centuries, but the recognition comes. Not because the system spontaneously became just, because people, historians, educators, community advocates, refuse to let his story stay buried. Here's what James Armistead Lafayette's story teaches us. First, strategic value isn't about position. It's about perspective. James was valuable precisely because he was overlooked. His invisibility became an operational advantage. In any organization, the people you're not paying attention to might be the ones who see things most clearly. Second, integrity under pressure defines character. James maintained his mission for 6 months, while everyone around him believed competing lies about his loyalty. He held his identity together when external forces tried to split apart. That's not just operational discipline. That's profound psychological strength. Third, justice delayed isn't justice denied, but shouldn't require heroic patience. James got his freedom. It took 5 years of petitions and a French general's advocacy. The system worked. Eventually, at enormous personal cost. We can acknowledge both that justice arrived and that it shouldn't have been that hard. And finally, your contributions may not be recognized in your lifetime. James died with a pension and local respect, but without national recognition. He did the work anyway. Not for glory, for principle. That's the definition of integrity. So what do you do with these 3 things? 1. When you're in a situation where you're overlooked or underestimated, that's not just a disadvantage. That can be strategic positioning. Use it. 2. When you're navigating conflicting loyalties or complex situations, hold your core truth. James knew who he was and what he was doing, even when everyone around him believed something else about him. That clarity saved his life. 3. When you're in a position to advocate for someone who won't be heard otherwise, do what Lafayette did. Use your platform. Put your reputation on the line. Privilege isn't just about what you have. It's about what you do with it. James Armistead Lafayette won the Revolutionary War from the inside. Then he won his freedom through the system. Then he won recognition, eventually from history. 3 impossible victories. 1 extraordinary life. The question isn't whether you'll face impossible situations. You will. The question is, When you're the person no one's paying attention to, will you use that invisibility for something that matters? James did, and it changed everything. James Armistead Lafayette proved that invisibility can be power, that integrity survives impossible pressure, and that justice, however delayed, is worth fighting for. But the question is, which of these three strategies will you apply first? Will you use being underestimated as positioning, hold your truth under conflicting pressures, or advocate for someone who needs your platform? Drop your answer in the comments. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if this documentary gave you a new lens on history and strategy, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're uncovering more brilliant strategists whose methods change history, but whose lessons can change your future.